Hello everybody, my name is Stefan White and I'm one of a very distinguished team of guest lecturers on Viking, and it's my pleasure to share with you tonight my knowledge about the world's greatest plant hunters. We're going to look at 5 of them. Originally I had entitled the talk The World's Greatest 12 Plant Hunters, thinking that I could do each in about 5 minutes so that the talk was about an hour long. Well, by the time I completed 3 of them, I realized that this was hugely overambitious. They are such fascinating stories and their achievements so wide that just 5 of them had nearly 60 slides and it took over an hour to tell. So I've restricted the talk to these 5. I could have omitted facts, but to me, the detail is often where the interest lies. For instance, one of those we'll hear about tonight was a wealthy landowner who became obsessed with botany. He was invited to go on Cook's second voyage around the world, having been on his first, but he refused to go unless space was found on the ship to accommodate his own private orchestra to amuse him whilst at sea. Well, the Admiralty refused. They said that the ship would not be safe with this extra accommodation, so he simply didn't go. Other plant hunters, no less interesting and amazing, will have to wait for other talks. But tonight you'll hear about the dangers they faced when travelling, often to completely unexplored regions of the world. Some were very lucky to survive, and some never made it home. I'm going to start with one of the great early pioneers of gardening and a great plant hunter. In researching this talk, I've read many books about pioneering gardeners, and strangely, few of them really acknowledge John Tradescant and the contribution he made. Some don't even mention him at all. As well as plants, he was an avid collector of, quote, anything rare and strange. He was born in Corton in Suffolk, England in 1570, and like his father, he gardened for local dignitaries. He was born in the reign of Elizabeth I. The old certainties were breaking down in politics, in religion, in art, in culture, philosophy, even geography. After all, America had only just been discovered. The era began in superstition and wonder, and it ended with the very dawning of science. His achievements were considerable. He founded Britain's first museum. He introduced many new plants to Britain, literally hundreds. He was head gardener to royalty and aristocrats, and he was keeper of the world's first botanic garden. With other later gardeners, his curiosity in collecting took Britain to the forefront of horticultural knowledge. Through him, and later other botanists, Britain became and remains a nation of gardeners. This photograph shows the Oxford University Botanic Garden, and he became keeper of the Physic Garden, as it was first called, and it was the first garden anywhere in the world devoted to the growing and study of botanical plants. John Tradescant's first important appointment was as head gardener to Lord Cecil at his home Hatfield House, shown here. He was a court favourite and a powerful leader. He was Queen Elizabeth's most trusted advisor. He jointly held 2 of the highest civil offices in the land. He was both Secretary of State and Lord Treasurer, and he became later Lord Salisbury. Hatfield still stands. It's open to the public. It's in Hertfordshire, about 21 miles north of London. Now, when he went there, John was already a successful gardener, He was experienced in preparing ground, planting, garden design, and overseeing landscaping. We know that Hatfield's gardens then had fountains, flower beds, fruit trees, and many varieties of trees. In these days, when the economy was almost always agrarian agriculture, gardens and lawn were a way of showing off power and wealth. Every piece of suitable land was used to the full for crops or raising cattle, sheep and goats, but if you were wealthy, you would be able to create gardens and lawns as a way of saying, I don't need to use all my land to make money. I can have some for my private pleasure of my family and my guests. Well, we have a list of the planting that John undertook. 453 cherry trees, gift of Sir John Tufton. 500 assorted fruit trees, the gift of the French Queen. 20,000 vines, gift of the French ambassador's wife. 500 mulberry trees, 400 sycamore trees, and 1,600 lime trees. Now the soil here was poor, so it needed enriching. Cow dung was regarded as better than horse dung. Ox blood mixed with pigeon dung was popular. And another gardener and contemporary author, Sir Hugh Platt, recommended for manure the shredding of cats and dogs. Not very nice. Lord Cecil wanted rare and beautiful plants, and he sent John on a buying expedition to the Low Countries in France in 1611, the Low Countries being today's Holland and Belgium. He was away for 14 weeks, and he visited nurseries, buying rare and beautiful plants, bulbs, as well as shrubs and trees, and these were transported to Hatfield by cart and by boat. This painting is by Ambrosius Boschart in 1610, and it shows various Dutch flowers of the period. And here you can see tulips. They were to become the subject of an extraordinary craze later, when the price of a single bulb was the equivalent to the price of a good town house. To give you some idea of the difficulties of travel in those times, we know it took John Tradescant 8.5 days to go from Brussels to Paris. By train or car today, less than 3 hours on a bad day. Lord Cecil died in 1612, and he was appointed as gardener to Edward Lord Wootton. And this photograph shows the remains of St Augustine's Abbey in Canterbury. Lord Wootton was a wealthy man and had been controller of Elizabeth I's household. The abbey was one of many that were partly demolished on Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries, and this photograph shows the remains, and that big spire in the background is Canterbury Cathedral in the background, so you can see how close it was to the city centre. In 1618, John joined an expedition to Russia. This expedition was led by Sir Dudley Digges, who was a friend of Lord Wootton. Digges's mission was to provide a loan in return for permission to cross Russia into Persia. John Tradescant, of course, wanted to find new plants and curiosities, and he explored the lands during his trip. Well, diplomatically, this expedition was a failure. No permission was ever granted, and the loan was never repaid. One of the most significant plants he brought back was Rosa muscovitica, but we know he also collected angelica, potentilla, saxifrage, sorrel, orange, bills, tulips, narcissi. He brought back seeds, bulbs, cuttings, and rooted plants. King James I was now on the throne, and he hated pirates who operated out of the Barbary ports of North Africa, Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli. They even raided Ireland and England, capturing people to sell as slaves. Well, John jumped at a chance to join a campaign against them. He joined the foray into the Mediterranean with the British fleet to crush the pirates. Unfortunately, it was commanded by a man later called one of the most inept admirals in history, Sir Robert Mansell, who set sail with 6 warships and 12 merchant ships. John took the opportunities to collect plants and rarities, and we know he brought back wild pomegranate trees, gladioli bulbs, the rock roses, the cistus, and the first ever apricot tree. Well, this expedition was a humiliating failure. It did no damage to the pirates, and the fleet was recalled. John co-sponsored an expedition to Virginia, the newly discovered New World. He couldn't spare the time to travel on this voyage, but he put money in to finance it. The colony had only been established for 12 years, and it left in 1622, and it came back a year later with plants and rarities. Later, John was to send his son John to the newly established colony there. This slide shows Captain John Smith, known as the Father of Virginia, meeting the Indian chief Powhatan. John worked for Lord Wootton for 9 years, and his next employment was as head gardener for George Villiers, the first Duke of Buckingham. This portrait of him is by Rubens. He was chief minister and became the highest ranking subject after the royal family. In 1625, John Tradescant joined the Duke on an expedition to the Low Countries, Holland, France, Belgium, northern France. He collected many plants, and many plants that were new to Britain were collected. The objective of this trip was to seal an anti-Habsburg alliance with any countries that could be persuaded to sign a treaty, and, sadly, to try and pawn the crown jewels to raise money for King Charles. Neither of these goals were achieved, but we know that he brought back from this trip anemones, ranuncula, lobelia, asters, irises, helichrysum, and geraniums. One of John's early patrons had been Sir Noel Caron, and after his death, John moved to one of his properties, shown top right here, in Lambeth, south of the Thames in London. This was to be the home for the rest of his life. New plants came from Europe, the Mediterranean, North America. We know that there were 770 varieties, including 170 varieties of fruit and 27 different roses. By 1632, the garden was ready. Now, soil around London was largely gravel, but gardeners developed a very lucrative trade because they were paid for their gravel for roads and ballast for ships, and to fill the holes that they made, they were paid by the City of London just across the river. They took the gravel over to the City of London, rapidly expanding, needing gravel, and they left behind big holes. And to fill the holes, they were paid by the City of London for collecting and disposing of human, horse, and other animal manure. And this, of course, improved the soil of the area tremendously. It became really the vegetable garden of London. Now, John was interested in anything that was rare and curious, and from the reign of King Charles I through the Civil War in England, it was visited and applauded by princes, foreign dignitaries, the aristocracy, early scientists, and school teachers. It contained rarities, fossils, shells, insects, dried plants, seeds, weapons, jewels, stuffed fishes, and animals, and, quote, every sort of natural and artificial wonder. Some items will be dismissed today as superstitious nonsense. Feathers from a phoenix, dragon's eggs, unicorn horn, and the hand of a mermaid. But some are still priceless scientific rarities today, like the only known remnants of a dodo. His collection, called the Ark, was later acquired by a wily lawyer called Elias Ashmole, who got John Tradescant the Younger, his son, drunk and had him sign a deed. It made the collection held in trust for Ashmole. When John the Younger died, it all passed to Ashmole, who persuaded Oxford University to found a museum in his name. The result is today's Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, who sadly do not acknowledge properly the Tradescants as the collectors whose work is the basis for the museum. Well, the Duke of Buckingham responded to appeals for help from the Huguenots, Protestants basically, besieged in La Rochelle in France, about halfway down the Bay of Biscay. In 1627, the forces left. It was a disaster. 7,833 men took part, and only 2,989 returned. John was really lucky to be alive. Why would you take a gardener on a military expedition like this? Well, the answer is that John could help with the engineering of trenches, defensive earthworks, and ramparts. He was used to landscaping. But of course, he went there to delight in the chance of collecting more specimens, and amongst other plants, mostly from the Ile de Ré, an island just off La Rochelle, he brought back the sea woodworm and the sea stock gillyflower. The Duke was assassinated, stabbed to death, on 23rd of August 1628. John Felton, a disgruntled army officer, stabbed him to death, and John had lost another great patron, so he went back to his Lambeth house and he opened his collection to the public. He was appointed keeper of the royal gardens, vines and silkworms, based at Oatlands Palace, shown bottom right there, and he worked for King Charles I and Queen Henrietta Maria. His salary was twice that paid by Robert Cecil. He was paid £100 per annum, but out of that, he had to supply all the materials and labour. He lived at Oatlands Palace, but he divided his time between lodging there and his house in South Lambeth. Sadly, Oatlands Palace was demolished after the Civil War. John Sr. died in 1638, and his funeral procession went from his house to his where he was buried, St Mary's, a church in Lambeth, right by the River Thames. His will left everything to John the Younger. He was a pioneering plant collector, always seeking the new and interesting, and he introduced hundreds of new plants from Europe, Russia, North Africa, and the new colony in America to England. At least something remains to honour John the Elder. Tradescantia, the spiderwort family, is a genus of 75 species of herbaceous perennial plants native to the New World, from southern Canada south to northern Argentina, including the West Indies. They were introduced as ornamental plants in the 17th century, and our next pioneering collector is John's son, John Tradescant the Younger. He received his training from his father, and this portrait of him is by Thomas de Critz. Although he did become royal gardener and travelled to Virginia 3 times, he was a shadow of his father. The Crown Colony was grouped around the James River in Virginia, and he sailed there in 1637, and he brought back, amongst other items, the swamp cypress on the left, the pitcher plant in the centre, and the tulip tree there on the right. The settlers had hoped to open a route to China. They thought an ocean lay just the other side of the Appalachian Hills, just inland from the coast, and these 3 plants are just amongst many that John sent back to England. He wouldn't have had an easy time in Virginia. Conditions were rough, food was scarce, and it was a hard life. And he did go there 3 times. He died in 1662, and this tomb is still existing in St Mary's in Lambeth, a strikingly original tomb, so much so that the diarist Samuel Pepys made a note and obtained an engraving of it. Well, it is as collectors that the Tradescants created their most lasting legacy. Plants, of course, were their special passion. Tradescant the Elder loved anything rare, new, quirky, or different. His son John was more of a simple gardener and collector of plants, but his father was a true original, a self-made man who trod his own path, which others, including his son, followed. Elias Ashmole comes out of the story with little credit, but he did at least assure the continued survival of some of the artifacts in the Ark. But he failed to acknowledge the Tradescant family properly, and he claimed the glory himself. The Tradescants were huge contributors to early gardening, and they were one of the founders of the English passion for plants and gardens. If you want to know more, there's a splendid book by Jennifer Potter called Strange Blooms. The second of our plant hunters is Sir Joseph Banks, known as the father of modern plant collecting. He was hugely influential and can be regarded as the virtual founder of the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew. He was born into landed gentry. At Eton Public School, aged 13, he saw a hedgerow in the summer evening light, and he discovered his calling in life. Aged 21, he inherited Reversby Estate, which gave him an income of about £5,000 a year. Today's equivalent would be about $7 million a year. And he had more income from mining interests elsewhere in England. At this time, people of his wealth and standing would undertake the grand tour of Europe. But he said, quote, "Every blockhead does that. My grand tour will be around the globe," end quote. In 1776, he secured an appointment on board HMS Niger as naturalist. It's shown here, the ship. It was a 7-month survey of Labrador and the Newfoundland coastline. In 1768, the Admiralty announced an expedition to the South Seas. It was to observe the transit of Venus, believing that this would help navigation. The expedition was commanded by Captain Cook. It was the circumnavigation of the globe. The ship was called the Endeavour. Banks paid the enormous sum of £10,000 for himself and a team of 9. That's about $15 million today. Foremost in his party was Dr. Daniel Carl Solander, a Swedish naturalist and a pupil of the great Carl Linnaeus. His team comprised a secretary, a scientific draftsman, 2 charged with drawing landscapes and figures, and the remaining 4 were servants, 2 of which were young boys. The ship was originally designed for a crew of 17, so it must have been rather cramped on board. There were 94. Throughout the voyage, a 3-year trip, Banks and Cook, 15 years his senior, had no arguments. The route took them to Madeira, Rio de Janeiro, around Cape Horn, Tahiti, New Zealand, Australia, Java, and South Africa. In Rio alone, Banks collected 316 different types of plant, including passion flowers. In Tierra del Fuego, at the tip of South America in the south, 2 men of his party died of hypothermia ashore. They were forced at times to eat raw vulture to survive, but they did collect another 125 plants. They collected jasmine and gardenia, and a native shown in the picture on the left here called Tupaia joined the ship. His passage paid for by Banks, and he's pictured here with sitting down Solander, Dr. Solander. On the way from Tahiti, the food became infested and scurvy broke out. They were attacked by fierce Maoris in New Zealand, who were cannibals. Tupaia was very useful in negotiating. It was found that their languages were really quite similar. Collected, amongst other plants, were flax, buttercup, speedwell, tree ferns, over 40 new species, and they discovered the passage between the North and South Islands of New Zealand. The Endeavour sighted the coast of Australia on the 17th of April 1770. At one time it was proposed to call Australia Banksia. 331 new Australian plants were collected, including eucalyptus, acacia, mimosas, and banksia. Specimens found in Botany Bay included the Australian red honeysuckle. This is an illustration from the Endeavour Journal of Joseph Banks, Volume 2. There are 170 species in a genus named after Sir Joseph Banks, the Banksia. They're in the plant family Proteaceae. Top left is Prionotes. On the right here is Serrata. Bottom left is Marginita, shown before and after antithesis. And bottom right is Baxteri. This is a small selection of plants found by Banks on his voyage, Viola Banksy, top left. This is the spinulosa in the middle here, the birthday candle plant it's called. Callistemon citrianus on the right here. Centre bottom is Sophora temperata, the wing-spotted, and bottom right is the normalis, a white climbing rose. An enormous variety of plants new to science. They stopped over in South Africa, but it was very short. There was no time for plant collecting there, and they came back. Of the original 94 crew, 42 didn't survive the journey. Banks wanted to accompany Captain Cook on his second circumnavigation of the globe. He insisted that there be room for his private orchestra to amuse him whilst at sea. The Admiralty made extra space and accommodation on the ship, but when it was built, it was taken out on trials by a senior naval captain who pronounced that the ship was top-heavy and unseaworthy. The Admiralty had had enough, and they removed the additional structures, and they advised Banks that there was no room for his orchestra, so he simply refused to go on the voyage. In 1771, King George III appointed him scientific advisor on the plant life of the dependencies of the Crown, a sort of unofficial director of Kew. George III and Joseph Banks enjoyed a close relationship, and their desire to develop economic uses for exotic and native plants, and it set the course for Kew Gardens' development. Over the coming years, he instigated collecting campaigns in South Africa, India, Abyssinia, China, and Australia, and plants and materials were shipped from the gardens to the colonies and vice versa. For example, in 1793, over 800 pots were transferred from HMS Providence to Kew Gardens after her voyages in the southern hemisphere. He asked for economic crops as well as ornamental plants because he saw the benefit of exchanging commercial crops between colonies, and it played a big part over the centuries in Britain's emergence as a world power and a trading nation. Banks moved his household from London back to his estate at Reversby. Trees planted there, brought back from his travels, became a feature of the garden, and some still survive to this day. From 1810 he was chair-bound and an invalid, but he persevered with his work. On the 1st of June 1820, plagued with gout, he relinquished his presidency of the Royal Society, a post he had held for 42 years. 18 days later, he died, but through his travels and his work at Kew, he is credited with the introduction of more than 7,000 new species of plants. But perhaps his greatest achievement and gift to the world of gardening was the creation of a systematic and worldwide plant hunting program. Many of the subsequent heroes of planting, collecting were sent out from Kew. The fourth of our plant heroes is Francis Masson. He was a fairly junior gardener at Kew, but he was plucked from obscurity by chance. Captain Cook was planning his second circumnavigation of the globe. We've heard how Joseph Banks demanded changes to the ship to accommodate his orchestra. This was refused and he wouldn't go. So Francis Masson was elected to take his place. Captain James Cook's voyages around the world. The first was an exploration. The second was to explore the southern Pacific and to test a copy of John Harrison's clock for use in navigation, and it did work spectacularly. The third voyage was for exploring the northern Pacific, although it was ultimately completed by his crew because Cook was killed by natives on the west coast of the big island of Hawaii in mid-February of 1779. On the 30th of October 1772, Cook piloted HMS Resolution into Table Bay at Cape Town, South Africa. They'd been at sea for 3.5 months, and Cook dropped off Masson, and he continued his voyage. Masson did not have an auspicious start to his South African journey. On his first excursion to explore Table Mountain, he completely lost his sense of direction and his track of time. He had been told of the escape of a gang of convicts, and as dusk fell, he heard men's voices and the menacing sound of clanking chains. He knew that to be caught meant certain death, and he spent a terrifying night in the undergrowth, huddled away out of sight. On the 10th of December 1772, he set out with a South African mercenary and a driver in a covered wagon. They covered about 400 miles, and they collected veld flora. Shown top left is the Trifilium grandiflora. On the right is the Agapanthus inapertus, the drooping Agapanthus. Masson teamed up with Carl Per Thunberg, a Swedish botanist. They left in a covered wagon on the 11th of September 1773. They collected gladioli, amaryllis, irises, and South Africa's national flower, the proteas. Shown left here is the Amaryllis belladonna, common name naked ladies, and on the right is the Protea cynaroides, known as the king protea. One of the dangers, apart from the proliferation of wild animals, was that the wagon frequently got stuck in hippopotamus holes when fording rivers. But on the 14th of December, they reached Port Elizabeth, 480 miles from the Cape. But Masson's guides refused to go into the snow mountains. They told him that fierce tribes of Hottentots would kill them there just for the iron on the wagon. When a pack of ravenous hyenas attacked the wagon, injuring the oxen, lion and buffalo were numerous, and evasive action had to be taken often. Among their discoveries on this voyage were, top left, Strelitzia reginae, the bird of paradise flower. You'll see here the red-hot poker, the Nymphaea ruperi. On the bottom left here, Senocchio cruenta, and on the right here, the Trillium grandiflora, the white trillium. And this photograph shows the example of the genus named after Francis Masson. This is Massonia longipes. These are charophytes, and there are 7 species of the genus. In all, on this trip, Masson found more than 100 types of succulents, and he also found euphorbias, ericas, and geraniums, and he would travel in the countryside by ox, drawn wagon, or by horse. Masson begged Q for another trip inland. His trip had lasted 4.5 months, and he covered more than 10,000 miles. He arrived back in Cape Town on the 29th of January, and he set out again on the 25th of September, this time for the Paarl region. And he got back to Cape Town on the 29th of December. In all, he had discovered and collected more than 500 new species. One of these was to be destined to become the largest pot plant in the world. This photograph shows it being repotted at Kew. A trunk of more than 4 meters long and weighing over a ton. It's a bit above the average pot plant. It's called the Don of the Palm House. It's a Jurassic cycad. Francis Masson found it in South Africa in the early 1770s. Staff used a 4-meter lifting gantry and metal stilts to move the plant, an effort which took 3 months just to plan. Masson begged Q for another plant hunting trip. On the 9th of May, he set out for Madeira, Tenerife, and the Azores. From there, 183 species were sent to Q. He sailed on to the West Indies. He was in Grenada, when the French attacked and he was captured and imprisoned. Only high-level intervention by Sir Joseph Banks secured his release, but all his plants were lost. He went on to St. Lucia, but bad luck struck again when a hurricane devastated the island and he lost all his specimens again. He returned to England with some plants, but much was lost. In the 8 years, he travelled to Portugal, Algeria, South Africa, America, Canada. In 1783, he set off for Portugal. 85, he went to South Africa again. 179 species were collected there, including the arum lily and Cape heathers. He made numerous trips into the interior in South Africa, and he returned to England in March 1795. But he was unable to settle, and wanderlust got him a voyage to North America. He left in September 1797. He came back in early 1781, but his ship was boarded by French pirates. He was forced into a German boat, and the ration was half a pound of bread a day, dirty water, and he had to sleep amongst ropes. In Canada, he found new trilliums. He was used to the heat of South Africa, but the cold got to him. His health deteriorated, and in the bitter winter of 1805, he died on December 23rd. The last of our great plant hunters is David Grandison Fairchild, born 1869, died 1954. He was an American botanist and plant explorer. He was responsible for the introduction of more than 80,000 exotic plants and varieties of established crops into the United States. Certain varieties of wheat, cotton and rice that he introduced became especially economically important. His far-reaching travels brought into cultivation in the US many important plants, including mangoes, alfalfa, nectarines, pistachios, dates, horseradish, bamboos, and flowering cherries. David Fairchild was one of the great plant explorers of all time. At the age of 22, he had created the section of Foreign Seed and Plant Introduction of the United States Department of Agriculture. And for the next 37 years, he travelled the world in search of plants of potential use to the American people. He retired in Miami in 1935, sharing his vast knowledge and experience in tropical plants with Colonel Rupert Montgomery, who founded the Botanical Garden and named it to honour his friend. Many plants still growing in the garden were collected and planted by Dr. Fairchild. We'll look a little more at this wonderful garden in a moment. In 1940, Fairchild embarked on a collecting expedition, sailing from the Philippines to the Indonesian archipelago on a special ocean-going Chinese junk called the Cheng Ho. The voyage provided many of the early botanical specimens before the outbreak of World War II forced the explorers to return home. David Grandison Fairchild was born in East Lansing, Michigan in 1869. In 1888, he graduated from Kansas State University of Agriculture, Manhattan. He also conducted graduate work at the University of Iowa in Iowa City and at Rutgers College in New Jersey. In 1889, he joined the United States Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C. as a botanist and plant explorer in the plant pathology section. Excursions throughout the Orient fostered in Fairchild a passion for exploration and tropical horticulture, an interest that he would pursue for the rest of his life. In 1903, he became acquainted with Alexander Graham Bell and his family in Washington, D.C. 2 years later, he married Bell's daughter, Marion Hubbard, known as Daisy Bell, and the couple settled in Chevy Chase, outside Washington, D.C. Their son was born in the summer of 1906, daughter born in 1909. In 1917, the Fairchilds began wintering in Coconut Grove. They purchased a property at 4013 Douglas Road, naming it the Kampong, which means a cluster of houses in Malay. Fairchild continued to travel all over the world, collecting plant specimens, and he brought them back to his Coconut Grove home. In 1928, he and Marion built a two-story residence there, and when Fairchild retired, several years later, the Kampong became the family's permanent residence. This man is Thomas Barber Lathrop, an American philanthropist and world traveler born in Alexandria, Virginia. He was the grandson of Governor James Barber of Virginia. He studied at the University of Bonn and at Harvard University. Around 1890, he inherited a sizable fortune from his father. As a young man, he'd been a reporter for the newspaper San Francisco Morning Call. And although he spent much of his time traveling, Lathrop considered the Bohemian Club in San Francisco as his home for the rest of his life. After he became wealthy, Lathrop traveled around the world many times, and in the 1890s he met the young biologist David Fairchild, who he persuaded to become a plant explorer. He financed Fairchild and accompanied him on some of his early travels. Lathrop's travels with Fairchild are described in detail in the Fairchild and books. In 1897, Fairchild helped fellow explorer Walter T. Swingle organize the USDA's Office of Foreign Seed and Plant Introduction. From 1904 to 28, Fairchild served as its chairman, and during that time many kinds of plants were introduced into the country. He was instrumental in establishing several plant introduction gardens throughout the US to screen plants with the potential to improve the diets and the industry of Americans. Among the facilities established by the Office of Foreign Seed and Plant Introduction was a new subtropical laboratory and garden in Miami. Fairchild's associate Walter Swingle convinced railroad tycoon Henry Flagler to give the USDA an acre of land along Biscayne Bay to be used for construction of a laboratory to study plant diseases. And he also persuaded another historic Miamian, Mary Brickell, to give him 6 acres across Brickell Avenue from Flagler's plot for use as a plant introduction site. In 1898, the USDA decided to lease, not own, these properties, and the tropical agricultural program took off in earnest, and Fairchild visited the garden in 1898. A new area of interest developed for Fairchild in 1929, the movement to establish a national park in the southern Everglades. As the first president of the Tropical Everglades Park Association, Fairchild brought his considerable reputation to the movement. He wrote essays, accompanied inspection parties, and he provided testimony regarding the region's natural values. The plant introduction facility that Swingle and Fairchild established in Miami moved to southern Dade County in 1921 after the War Department offered the abandoned Chapman Field to the USDA. On the 26th of April, 1923, the first trees were planted at the new USDA Plant Introduction Garden in Chapman Field, and the period of great plant explorations continued unabated throughout the 1920s, when Fairchild and others were bringing thousands of new plant specimens into the station for propagation. The Kampong is an 11-acre tropical garden in Coconut Grove, an area of the city of Miami in Florida. It's one of the 5 gardens of the non-profit National Tropical Botanical Garden, and it's open to visitors. There is an admission fee charged. At his home in Florida, Fairchild created a garden that contained many of the plants that he obtained through his trips. Fairchild and his wife made the Kampong their permanent home from 1928 until their passing in 1954 and 1962 respectively. Today, the Kampong's living collections include tropical fruits including pomelo, 23 avocado varieties, and 65 varieties of mangoes, palms, flowering trees, figs, and bamboo. The Fairchild Tropical Botanic Garden is an 83 acres botanical garden with extensive collections of rare tropical plants, including palms, cycads, flowering trees, and vines. It's located in Coral Gables in Florida. It was established in 1936 by Robert H. Montgomery, an accountant, an attorney, and a businessman with a passion for plant collecting. The garden opened to the public in 1938, and he named it after his good friend David Fairchild. David retired to Miami in 1935, but many plants still growing in the garden were collected and planted by him, including a giant African baobab tree. New and popular features here include butterfly garden, a bird watching section, the Victoria Pond, 4 Amazon water lilies, tropical fruit pavilion. There's a 13-acre palm collection, greenhouse with orchids. The Fairchild Tropical Botanic Garden manages one of the largest and most dynamic plant conservation programs in any US botanic garden. The Fairchild, along with Miami-Dade Natural Areas Management, is conserving more than 85 species of locally threatened plants. There are more than 3,700 plants planted at Fairchild. More than 550 species are representative. The cycad collection includes representations of most of the world's 200+ species. It's the largest US collection with more than 700 living plants, and it serves as an important safeguard against extinction and research. Few of the plants introduced to America by Fairchild include bamboo, dates, mango, and nectarine. He was a meticulous researcher, and he wrote in his book, The World Was My Garden, about manure. He said, "After my first feeling of revulsion at plants passed, I spent 3 of the most entertaining and instructive weeks of my life studying the fascinating molds which appeared one by one on the slowly disintegrating mass of horse dung. Microscopic molds are both very beautiful and absorbingly interesting. The rapid growth of their spores, the way they live on each other, the manner in which different forms come and go is so amazing and varied that I believe a man could spend his life and not exhaust the forms or problems contained in one plate of nature." He wrote 4 books that describe his world travels and his activities, including new species that he brought to the United States. In addition to sharing some of his legendary tropical botanical expertise, he provided graphic accounts of long-gone native cultures that he was able to see before they were modernized. He was an accomplished photographer and illustrated many of his books himself. The World Was My Garden, Travels of a Plant Explorer, was published in 1938. Garden Islands of the Great East, 1943. The World Grows Round My Door, the story of Kampong, a home on the edge of the tropics, 1947. And Exploring for Plants. And in addition, Fairchild and his wife Marion wrote this early work, The Book of Monsters, published in 1914. He wrote many monographs about plants, plant exploring, and the transportation of plants in the United States. Anne Archbold, daughter of the co-founder of Standard Oil, was enthusiastic about funding an expedition and even participated himself. But it was apparent that this trip needed its own custom-built research ship, and Anne agreed to have the ship built and recruited Ted Kilkenny, an experienced yachtsman and adventurer, to build and captain the ship. They met in the Philippines in the late 1939, and the very first Fairchild Tropical Garden plant expedition began. The Chung Ho and crew intended to sail for the next 2 years, collecting plants and seeds to be sent back to the garden. But within 6 months, Germany had invaded Poland, and increasing conflict in the islands made further travel impossible. Although shortened, the trip was very fruitful. More than 500 different types of plants were collected and shipped to the garden, including more than 90 species of palms and many ornamental trees and numerous vines. And several of these plants are still growing in the garden. Fairchild is a variety of mango selected by him and his family in the early 1900s in the Panama Canal zone. They got a lemon juicy skin, and they come to maturity in June and July, deep orange and aromatic with a rich spicy flavor. It always ranks amongst the top cultivars of the annual International Mango Festival. Highly tolerant to disease, and it does well in humid conditions, making it a natural for South Florida. The tree is the most ornamental of mangoes, and it can be maintained, and it has a height and a spread of about 8 feet, perfect for those with a modest-sized garden. The mangosteen, dubbed the queen of tropical fruit by the American explorer David Fairchild, it's a dark rind full of tannins, hides virginal white segments resembling those of an orange. This is a Cattleya named after David Fairchild, Dupreniana cross Lodis gessi. David Fairchild worked in the US Agriculture Department, but he rarely worked at the department. Instead, he was sent to Java, Europe, Australia, and the South Pacific to find, research, and catalogue plant life. Among the numerous species he introduced to the USA were avocados, bamboo, the flowering cherry tree, now so popular and famous in Washington, D.C., horseradish, East Indian mangoes, nectarines, papaya, pistachios, and Chinese soya beans. Even in retirement, he continued to lead expeditions to distant corners of the globe, including his last expedition to Central America when he was 75 years old. I'm often asked how collectors transported plants, sometimes over huge distances. Botanists and commercial nurserymen had been passionately prospecting the world for new plants since the end of the 16th century, but these had to travel mostly as seeds or corms or dry rhizomes and roots. Rooted plants could be sent short distances, wrapped in damp cloths, and some were placed in pottery pots. Plants often didn't survive the long trips, however, especially by boat, where they had to be on deck to get light, but salt spray could easily destroy them. Many important species were lost. The breakthrough came in 1829 when Dr. Nathaniel Bagshaw Ward performed an experiment which led him to discover that plant life could survive nearly untouched beneath glass. His display at the World's Fair in 1829 drew vast attention, which led to Wardian cases being used to transport exotic plants from distant lands. With the new Wardian cases, tender young plants could be set on ships' decks to benefit from daylight, and the condensed moisture within the case kept them watered, but protected from salt spray. The first test was made in July 1833, when he shipped 2 specially constructed glazed cases filled with British ferns and glasses, all the way to Sydney, Australia, a voyage of several months that found the protected plants still in good condition when they arrived. Some more interesting plants made the return trip. A number of Australian native species that would never have survived transportation previously, and they arrived in good shape after a stormy voyage around Cape Horn. The Wardian case being filled in the photograph on the right there remained in use at Kew until the 1960s, where air transporter and other transportation means superseded it. When we talk about plant hunters, it often sounds as if that chapter of our history is closed. Nothing could be further from the truth. For while the political, social, and technological circumstances that propelled the heyday of plant collecting are gone, plant hunting itself is still very much alive and has taken on vital new significance. Despite challenges posed by modern travel restrictions and regulations, plant collectors traverse the globe every day in search of new or rare species and varieties. These are now nearly all sponsored by governments and by scientific organisations. Kew's Millennium seed product in Wakehurst in Kent in England is the largest plant conservation product in the world. The focus is on global plant life faced with the threat of extinction and plants of most use for the future. The seeds they save are conserved outside their native habitat. Working with a network of partners across 50 countries, they have successfully banked 10% of the world's wild plant species, and their target is to save over 25% by 2022. They focus on plants and regions most at risk from climate change and the ever-increasing impact of human activities. Individual countries now take an active role in protecting their native flora, collaborating with collecting teams to ensure both in situ and ex situ species preservation. The focus of the late 20th and 21st century plant exploration has clearly shifted to emphasize conservation, education, and the defense of biodiversity, demanding more than ever before that today's plant hunters share the spirit and the tenacity and the passion of their very distinguished predecessors. Well, sadly, that's all we've got time for. You've heard about 5 brave, determined and resourceful men who've added a great deal to our gardens. There simply isn't time to tell you about the many other major plant collectors. So when you next go into your own garden or visit others, remember the men who risk their lives to bring variety to gardens. My name is Stefan White. I hope that you've been informed and entertained, and I thank you very much for listening, and I'll now be happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Stefan. Our first question for tonight comes from Jacqueline, and she's in Florida. And she says, what do you think was the most important plant discovered by these plant hunters in terms of its impact and how it then changed the world and the economy?
Yes, a very good question. There are many plants that are not, of course, just decorative. They are commercial crops. Without wheat and corn, the human species probably couldn't have survived. When you look at things like the rubber plant and how that revolutionized the industrial revolution, when you look at coffee as a major plant that is now very used, these are some of the most important plants. I think I've been talking largely about decorative plants for our gardens, but of course the ones that have really made the most contribution to our human species have been the ones that have fed us and created crops that are essential to life today.
Thank you. A question here from Maxine. She's in Lexington in the United States, and she says, were the plants that were collected logged into one central book or catalogue which combined the finds of these many different collectors?
There are a number of encyclopedia of plants that have been issued over the years. Obviously, new plants are being discovered every year, and we do get new species, even new genesis that are being discovered in remote parts of the world that are still unexplored. There are many places on this earth that are unexplored, but there are still some. And the jungles of South America and some places like Borneo are still producing new plants. So these always have to be added to these encyclopedias. And there are certainly a number of volumes that contain a description of all known botanical plants. But to put it all into one volume would be impossible, obviously. So there are many volumes. There are volumes on ferns, there are volumes on palms, there are volumes on vegetables, there are volumes on orchids, roses, you name it. To try and cram all that into one volume would be impossible. So the answer to your question, I think, is yes, there are recorded, printed works which can be referred to, but you'd have to go to many in order to get the full picture.
Thank you. David in Orlando asks, were some of the collected rare plants collected because they could be used for medicinal purposes originally in their native lands?
Absolutely. In England, the earliest gardens were called physic gardens, and they were used to grow plants purely for medicinal purposes. The two famous ones are the Chelsea Physic Garden in London and the Oxford Botanic Garden, as it's now known. And these were devoted to growing plants for medicine, and plants were very, very important to early medicine. Many of the drugs that we know today have been developed from plants, and it is, I think, critical that the medicines, many of them originated from plants, and there were gardens specifically devoted to nothing but medicinal purposes. So many have been crucial to the abolition of some. One example that comes to mind is quinine, a plant which has virtually eradicated malaria, which has been a terrible killer for centuries, and is now, I think, close to extermination, and that's down to this plant.
Thank you. Virginia in San Francisco asks, did the early plant hunters encounter many poisonous plants? Are there any records of fatalities amongst the explorers or their teams as they discovered some harmful plants?
Yes, there are indeed. When you look at a plant, you can't always tell that it is poisonous. Nature is wonderful in sometimes, in insects, for instance, if it's bright red, that will be a deterrent for any predator to eat it because it's indicating it's poisonous. You can't do that with plants. There is a terrible plant that grows wild called wolfsbane is one of its names. It's got a number of other names. And as recently as about 10 years ago, a gardener on an estate in Hampshire in England was admitted to hospital and with terrible internal problems, and he took 5 days to die, and they couldn't really explain it. And his father determinedly, in a forensic way, examined exactly what had happened, and it turned out that all he had done was to brush against this wolfsbane. He hadn't eaten it, he hadn't cut it, he hadn't got the sap into him or anything like that. He had simply gone into a patch of it, and it had brushed against him, and he was dead. And that is one example of how even a practiced gardener can be misled into thinking, well, this plant is harmless. And yes, there were plant hunters who were unaware of the dangers of certain plants. I do a talk called Horrific Horticulture, which warns against some of the more common plants that are found in gardens throughout Europe and America that can cause anything from a rash, such as poison ivy and nettles, to the wolfsbane, which can kill. So yes, certainly we know of many of these earlier plant hunters who died through handling poisonous plants, and it still happens today.
Thank you. Question here from Janet. She's in San Diego, and she says, after this period of enthusiasm for collecting new plant species, when did the thinking change to understand, as we do more now, that it is not actually very good to introduce non-native plants? Was this something that was considered at the time of these early plant hunters?
With the early plant hunters, I don't think anybody ever thought that introducing a plant from one geographic area to another could cause problems. It's only recently, I think, where certain non-indigenous plants, not grown in the area but brought in from outside, have caused problems. Here in England, we've got this terrible plant called the Japanese knotweed, which can almost avoid any attempt at eradication. It's where it establishes itself, so the roots and the rhizomes go underground, and they are so strong they can break through concrete. And that's an example of a dreadful mistake in bringing that in. Some plants have been introduced into rivers, and they have taken over the ecology of the river and smothered life in it. So you do have to be careful when you're bringing new plants in. I think in the early days, there was no suspicion that a plant could be harmful and could actually cause damage to the natural ecology of an area. And I think it's only fairly recently that one has began to realize that, yes, be careful about what you bring in because it can seriously damage nature.
Thank you, Stefan. A question here from Jerry in the United States, and he says, in total, how many plant species do you estimate exist?
Oh, goodness me. We know that two of the people we've talked about today, John Tradescant the Elder, introduced way over 1,000 species new to England. And we know that Joseph Banks was responsible for 7,000 new introductions. So I have not got a clue the total of species there are in the world, but it must measure into the hundreds of thousands.
Wonderful, thank you. Myrtle in Metairie in the United States says, fascinating talk, thank you. Can you recommend any books to read more about the lives of these explorers?
Yes, I can. Strange Blooms by a lady called Jennifer Potter is a very scholarly work about John Tradescant. About a quarter of the book is just the references, the sources of her information. It's a bit dry, and there was another author in this country, in Great Britain, who has made a fortune out of historical fiction, and several of those were based around John Tradescant, but it's fiction. It's her interpretation of his relationship with Lord Cecil, his relationship with the Duke of Buckingham, and it's fantasized. So you have to be a little bit careful choosing between fictional accounts and proper accounts. So yes, there are many books on Banks, of course, one of the greatest of the botanists that the world has ever produced. Fairchild, I'm sure there are many books about his life, but there are also books called something like The Greatest Plant Hunters, which will give you a brief overview of some of the most important.
Thank you, Stefan. And just to finish off for tonight, we've got a question here from James in the United Kingdom, and he just asks, can you tell us, how did you become interested in botanical history and these early plant hunters?
There's a simple answer to that question. I got interested because I got drunk. A friend of mine owns a lovely boat called an Edwardian Gentleman's Luncheon Launch, and he has it on the Thames near to where I live. And he took us out for a lunch one day. It seats about 8 people inside, and you can also have 8 people outside. And after rather too much Chablis and a bit too much champagne, one of the other guests said, "Stefan, I have terrible trouble finding speakers for our garden club." And I said, "Oh, don't worry about that, Caroline, dear girl. I'll do a talk for you." The next morning, with a horrible hangover, she phones up, "Right, Stefan, I booked you in for October the 15th. What? Anyway, I had in the back of my mind John Tradescant, because I'd seen a very brief black and white documentary on BBC Two about this extraordinary man. And I thought, that's an interesting story. Anyway, I researched it, and my first talk, which I called Skullduggery in the Shrubbery, was all about John Tradescant and his son. And so from there, other people started to express interest in getting talks, so I did a few more talks. If I was to put on my passport these days, occupation, in my retirement after a successful entrepreneurial business career, I might put historian, botanical historian, because the history of gardens and of gardening has always fascinated me, and so that's my speciality. In fact, I have been commissioned by an American author to write a book, which I have now just finished. It's due for publication in spring of next year, and it's called Heroines of Horticulture, and it's all about 100 pioneering American women gardeners. Some were landscape architects, some were authors, some were, and I think amongst the most praiseworthy were two women in particular who were determined to instill in young children a love of nature and of gardening. And they started programs in schools to enthuse children into nature. So yes, horticulture, gardening, botany has always been my special interest, and that is what I hope you found interesting tonight.
Thank you so much, Stefan. That's wonderful.
My next cruise is on Viking, and it will be October the 15th to the 29th on Viking Sky. So if you happen to be on that cruise, I shall be there giving talks that are not necessarily horticultural. Viking like people to give, guest lecturers these days, to give talks of enrichment value related to the area. So we're going to be in Greece and Turkey, so I'll be doing talks about that area, but not necessarily gardening. I now in cruise ships do a lot of talks that are of general historic importance to the itinerary of the cruise.